Hi, Kate here with another video. Hope everyone's doing well. This video is on a narrative which began during the Trump administration, still continuing. I think it's a very insidious narrative, labeling many people on the left, organizers, activists, journalists, writers, as being fascists, as being like red, brown, Strasserites, Nazbols, third positionists, various terms. And it's used against almost anyone who's strongly anti-imperialist, anyone who pushes back against identity politics, which is the overwhelming emphasis of the Democratic Party, minus any class struggle, anyone who pushes back against this, and anyone who takes a populist approach, wants to talk directly to working class people, is almost labeled as red, brown, a Strasserite, a fascist. Now, what do these terms mean historically? People do ask, like, somebody's called a Nazbol. It's a very common slur. What does this mean? Where does it come from? What's going on here? So I'm going to give a historical background explaining what these mean. The various attempts to combine left and right. The term Nazbol came out of Germany and the German Communist movement in the early 1920s. It's kind of complicated. So I'm going to give a little historic background. I can't really escape it. I'll try to keep this really brief. I'm going to try to make this a brief video. Background here. So Germany, before World War One, had the largest socialist party in the world, the SPD. It was the flagship party of the socialist movement around the world. It was founded by followers and collaborators of Karl Marx. The SPD became a mass party. I think it was peak of 1.5 million people. It was a quarter of the German industrial working class. They stood for basically a socialist transformation of society. They weren't just another political party. They want to radically transform society. But, excuse me, as they grew, they were subject to increasingly powerful reformist pressures to move to the right. And there were big fighting in the party. There was big fighting between left and right factions and groups, really complicated. By the early 1900s, it was increasingly apparent Europe was going to there was a general European war coming, and the socialist parties of Europe denounced it, saying, it's going to be a bourgeois war. The capitalist classes of each country are going to pit us against workers from other countries, and we're going to resist it. And however, when finally push came to shove, war broke out. The German SPD and most of the other socialist parties of Europe actually supported it, supported their own country in this war. The SPD famously voted for war credits, like money for the war. And this was considered an enormous betrayal of the socialist movement, of everything socialism stood for. The Socialist International was shattered, was broken, and socialist workers from different countries were fighting each other in basically a very brutal, bloody capitalist war, the First World War. World War One. So the left of the SPD was very unhappy about this, but they felt there wasn't anything they could do about it. Until finally, the Russian Revolution in October 1917 was huge, a huge shot in the arm that the leftists anywhere made a huge impact. And also Germany began losing the war. By 1918, war went very badly, and then finally lost the war. This gave an opening to the left. Really complicated. There were splits in the SPD from the left. Several of these. The most important one was led by a couple of people, mainly Rosa Luxemburg, who was the leader, basically the main leader of the left wing in the SPD, and Karl Liebknecht, who was a delegate, a member of parliament, an MP, a socialist MP. He was one of the first people to break from supporting the war, and he became something of a folk hero. So they and a few others founded what was called the Spartacus League. Der Spartacus Bund, named after Spartacus, a Roman gladiator who was a socialist hero. Anyway, the part of the Spartacus League in Germany, this group had nothing to do with a later U.S. group with the same name, the Spartacus League. If you spend any time along the left, you'll kind of encounter the Sparts. They hate to be called the Sparts. I think it's derogatory, but the Spartacus League in the U.S. has a weird reputation. They heckle in leftist meetings. Main politics are denouncing people and yelling at people. Anyway, they have no connection with Rosa Luxemburg's group except for the name. So the Spartacus League, the German Spartacus League, became the nucleus of what became the German Communist Party, the KPD, which became a mass party. Okay, but before that happened, when Germany lost the war, the army, which was basically running Germany, they basically handed power over to the SPD, over to the socialists. So, like, okay, you guys are in charge. Like, finally, after all these years, the socialists were running Germany. They formed a German government. And by this time, though, they were solidly right wing, like within relative terms. The leaders were bureaucratic hacks, and they were on the right. They hated revolution. They actually crushed a socialist revolution. They crushed workers' uprisings. From about 1919 to 1923, there was a revolutionary climate in Germany, and workers were seizing factories and had formed revolutionary governments. But the SPD fought against it. They tried to co-opt it as much as they could. When that didn't work, they hired right-wing private armies called Freikorps, which were used to crush, to kill the socialists, kill these radical leaders. And Rosa, at one point, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, and the leaders of the Spartacus League were killed. The organization continued. So not only did the socialists, the moderate socialists, support World War I, which was a huge betrayal. When the socialist revolution finally broke out, they crushed it. They bloodily crushed it. So huge betrayal. So for a time, there was a powerful in Europe, among socialist activists, a powerful ultra-left feeling, mood, powerful ultra-left mood. People didn't want to work with like more moderate workers, members of these other parties. They didn't want to work with like SPD trade unions and so on. Lenin thought this was a counterproductive attitude. He wrote a really famous book, Left Communism and Infantile Disorder, where he critiqued this mood. And it was largely successful. The ultra-left mood dissipated after that. But before that happened, there was actually a split. Now, the KPD, the German Communist Party, the original leaders were killed, but the party was huge. It became a mass party. Germany, for a while, had the second largest communist party in the world. The Soviet Communist Party was the largest, but the German Communist Party was huge. And there was a time when Germany could have had a socialist revolution. They were on the brink of it. The KPD, communists made some really bad moves, bad tactics, but that's a whole nother story. So there's this ultra left mood, and there was a split in the KPD, a group called the KAPD, the Communist Workers' Party of Germany. They were largely syndicalists. There's syndicalism as a philosophy in direct rule by trade unions, sort of a non-political revolutionary orientation. Marxists generally have not liked this approach. Okay, so there's the KAPD, and I believe they lasted about a year. They were kind of an unstable group, but they were largely syndicalists. The Hamburg, Germany branch. Hamburg is like an industrial seaport city, and there's a movement within the Hamburg branch of the KAPD, which came to be known as National Bolshevism. Basically, these people wanted to combine communism with German nationalism. Now, the historic context: Germany had lost World War One. They had the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany was forced to pay huge, damaging reparations, which crippled the German economy. Germany couldn't have a military. In 1923, the French occupied the Ruhr Valley coal mining region of Germany. When Germany fell behind on the reparations payments, they actually occupied the Ruhr Valley. So there's a wave of nationalism against this. So these national Bolshevik people tried to combine communism with the feeling of German nationalism. They also kind of developed a theory that like Germany was a proletariat nation. Germany was defeated in the war, and the capitalist countries like Britain, France, and the U.S. would never treat them fairly. And so they tried to appeal to German nationalist sentiment as well as they regard themselves, as far as I know, as communists, but they combine some kind of nationalism, and they were kind of maybe class collaborationist, that Germany itself was a proletariat nation, and, not to fight against their own ruling class, but a kind of national communism. Uh, as far as I understand them, this feeling was they were not too popular. They were called. Lenin thought they were ridiculous. There's a radical lawyer named, not radical journalist named Karl Reid, interesting figure. A brief digression here. Karl Radek was a Polish socialist. He came to Germany, was on the left wing of the SPD. He worked as a journalist. He was an ally of Rosa Luxemburg. There was a scandal happened years earlier when he was young. Apparently, he was accused of stealing a book and a coat from someone in a socialist meeting. And apparently, he was kicked out or expelled from the Polish Socialist Party. This was years earlier. When later he came to Germany, was an ally of Rosa Luxemburg on the left wing of the SPD, and the right wing brought up this scandal. It was called the Reid affair, and it was really embarrassing to the left wing. So Rosa Luxemburg heeded Karl Radek, even though they were kind of political allies. So Karl Radek, anyway, before World War One, I believe he went to Russia, joined the Bolshevik Party. The Bolsheviks then sent him back to Germany as kind of their ambassador or their representative to the German left wing, the German revolutionaries, when there was this revolutionary climate. And Karl Reid actually coined the term National Bolsheviks, National Bolshevism. He denounced this movement, but he had a similar tactic himself. He was in jail for, I believe, 4 months, and he met with members of the German right wing, tried to move them left, tried to convince them that Germany will never be treated fairly by the capitalist powers. You have to move closer to the Soviet Union, maybe adopt some socialist programs, nationalize industries, and stuff like that. In his case, I think this was a correct approach. He was trying to move these people, the German right, away from their natural political home. The other group, the earlier group there, and it was not, I don't think that was not a correct approach. It was just really confused and weird. But okay, I'm not an expert on this, but that's just where the term National Bolshevism or Nazbol came from. Okay, so then I'm unclear what to classify these people as. Some of the later National Bolsheviks, there's several waves, several currents, might have been kind of proto-Nazis in a way, but I'm not super knowledgeable about these groups. Okay, so a bit later, there was a movement, a faction within the Nazi party, called the Strasserites, led by a guy named Gregor Strasser. Gregor Strasser was not a socialist. He did not have a background in this movement. He said he was in the Freikorps. He was in one of these right-wing private armies. He was a part of the Hitler's beer hall putsch, famous. It was attempted a coup. It failed. Hitler was arrested. He was in jail for 9 months. So was Gregor Strasser. Gregor Strasser was released earlier from prison than Hitler was. So the Nazi Party was banned for about a year, and there was a more amorphous group movement took its place, the National Socialist Movement, and Gregor Strasser became a leader of this and wanted to move it in like a socialist direction. He wanted to like nationalize industries and more of a closer alliance with the Soviet Union. You could argue this is not a left-wing Nazi is kind of a contradiction in terms, but you could debate about this. Be that as it may, he wanted to move the Nazi party kind of. He's a left-wing Nazi basically. There were street battles in Berlin between these different factions. Okay, so Hitler got out of jail. There was a power struggle. Hitler won. Gregor Strasser kind of agreed to drop out of politics. He was a chemist, actually. He went back to working as a chemist. And there's some deal worked out that the Nazis would kind of leave when they came to it, would kind of leave him alone as long as he stayed out of politics. Well, during I believe it was 1934, the Night of the Long Knives, he was killed by the Nazis in one incident. And his theory, his philosophy was very popular among like the brown shirts, the SA, Ernst Röhm's group. And they were purged, and that element was whole purged. He had a brother, Otto Strasser, who left Germany but continued this movement. He had a group called the Revolutionary National Socialists, and later on, like 1960s in West Germany, he ran some kind of like a neo-Nazi group. Whole other story. But anyway, so Strasserism is kind of a left-wing Nazi. You could say it's a contradiction terms or whatever. Okay, one more group later in Russia in the 1990s. There was a party called the National Bolsheviks. It was founded by two people. One guy, Edward Limonov, Russian novelist, writer. Limonov was, I guess, could be considered the Russian version of Charles Bukowski, if this makes sense. He was kind of a bohemian figure. I've read some of his stuff. He was an interesting writer. His politics were weird, but he collaborated with a Russian philosopher, Alexander Dugin. Now, Dugin kind of I really don't know how to typify him. At the time, he regarded himself as a Marxist, but kind of a very eccentric variety of it. He was actually a co-founder of the Russian Communist Party, not the original Communist Party of Lenin, but the later Russian Communist Party of the Russian Federation. He was also an influence on Putin. So anyway, they collaborate in this National Bolshevik Party. They're usually regarded as fascist, as a fascist party. uh, Limonov left. That they had to split, and he moved. His group moved more to the left. I think he regarded this whole thing as kind of a spoof, a postmodernist spoof. There were a lot of members were from art students, Moscow Academy, and they collaborated. They were part of this. Dugin in turn left. He developed a kind of a Eurasianist philosophy. His book is called The Fourth Theory. I haven't read it. Apparently, I don't know if Dugin could be considered a fascist or not. At the beginning of this book, according to what I've heard, he denounces fascism, and he's kind of a Eurasianist. That is, thinks that Russia and other Asian countries are naturally collectivist, along with indigenous cultures around the world, like Venezuela. And he says they're communalist or collectivist. This is opposed to like the Atlanticist cultures like the U.S., Britain, Western Europe, or individuals. He sees kind of a culture struggle. A lot of people do claim that Dugin is a fascist. He very well might be. I don't really know. I've heard both sides, so I don't know how to classify him exactly. Okay, so anyway, Dugin left the National Bolshevik Party. I think they're still around. He kind of went off on his own. So the reason why I spent time talking about Dugin is because he comes in the story a bit later. Okay, there are also been other groups and movements kind of similar. Let's see, there's a group movement called the National Anarchist, started by a guy named Troy Southgate, British guy who was one of the leaders of the British Green Party. He formed this weird right wing, basically fascist anarchist group. And they have imitators in the U.S. The Banna Bay Area National Anarchists. I don't know if they're still around. There's this guy, Francis Yockey, Yockeyism. Francis Yockey was an American Nazi, a neo-Nazi from active in the 50s and 60s. He was a big supporter of Hitler during World War II, and he was active in the 50s and 60s. And he had solidarity with third world liberation movements. Like he was literally a Nazi. A Nazi who read Frantz Fanon, if that's possible, if you can imagine that. And there are a few other weird figures. There's a guy, Matt Heimbeck, who had this group, the Traditionalist Workers' Party. It imploded in 2018. His group imploded in 2018. Some bizarre incident where he was sleeping with his father-in-law's girlfriend. His father-in-law found out, and they got into a fight. Heimbeck was arrested for assault, and in retaliation, his father-in-law was in charge of the membership, and he deleted all the membership files. The organization was gone. Heimbeck lost a lot of credibility in this incident, and he tried to do some kind of regroupment, tried to rebuild some group. It didn't work. Then he tried to join other Nazi parties. They wouldn't have him because they thought of him, ironically, as a commie, as a communist. So there's some other groups like this. They're small, marginal. There have been weird groups. They don't have any influence. Some influence in Russia, in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk, the Donetsk People's Republic. This kind of mood, as I understand, is kind of a mood like Soviet nostalgia. So some people regard themselves as communists, like, but with a big chunk of Russian nationalism. Some people consider this fascism. I don't know. I don't know. But I'm just mentioning these groups. Outside of that, they're marginal, small, not much of an influence. Okay, so this narrative, as far as I know, the master narrative began by a guy named Alexander Reid Ross. He's an anarchist. He's an academic. He's an adjunct faculty at a community college in Portland, Oregon, which has a huge anarchist scene. Alexander Reid Ross was background in the anarchist movement, fairly prolific writer. Was the editor of Earth First Journal and a variety of other stuff. Anyway, he came out with this book in 2017 called Against the Fascist Creep, and I have a copy of it under my microphone. I have a copy of it here, and the cover art is pretty wild. Um, Basically, it gives a history. I haven't read the whole thing. I thumbed through it, and I got the arguments. I haven't. I admit, one of these books I bought, and I don't know why I bought it. I think I bought it Left Forum a couple of years ago. Anyway, the book, Alexander Reid Ross's basic idea is that fascism is a creep. Like, he doesn't mean like a fascist creep, like a bad person. He means like it's a creeping phenomena. And like people on the right wing used to talk about creeping socialism, like any government programs are somehow creeping socialism. Socialists disagree, of course, that socialism is qualitatively different than capitalism, that, it's ruled beyond the rule of capital, ruled by working people. Uh, but the government programs aren't socialism, they're just designed to stabilize capitalism. So anyway, Alexander Reid Ross had a similar theory about fascism. It's a creeping phenomena. There's different interpretations or theories about fascism, but most people on the left, some theory, basically it happens in a period of crisis. The ruling class can no longer rule society in the same way. Um, there's a major disorientation. Bourgeois democracy is not working anymore. Major upheaval. um, Also, the largest social basis of fascists is a failure. It comes in the wake of failure of the left to providing leadership. Like fascism comes in the wake of a failed revolution, which happened in Italy, Germany, and other places. If the Bolsheviks had lost the Russian Revolution or the Russian Civil War, there would have been some fascism there. Leon Trotsky, wrote about this. Anyway, so it comes in the wake of a failure of the left, and the social basis for fascism are what they call petty bourgeois, like small business owners, professional people, managers, academic people. They're the petty bourgeois class, and they're kind of up against it. They resent the big capitalists who are really giving them a horrible time, but they're also terrified of the radical working class below them. So they're kind of stuck in a middle layer, and they're incapable of really forming a common demand because they're separate. The petty bourgeois, it's very difficult for them to reach some kind of unity. So they rally around a demagogic leader who often uses anti-capitalist slogans, but fascists always abandon them once they get to power. And fascism unleashes extreme violence. It's known for that. This petty bourgeois against workers' movements, against communists, socialists, everything like that, and can be extremely violent. So fascism could be seen as a virus in that sense. It comes in a period of crisis. Okay, so Alexander Reid Ross's theory is that it's a creeping phenomena. It's infecting large parts of the U.S. and the Western left. That's basically his idea. And sorry, I just got that's basically his idea. Now he develops this, I'd say, trifecta, odd thing between Trump, Russia, Putin, and Syria, the Syrian civil war. That's basically his like weird trifecta. Uh, Basically plays on now Trump, the idea like liberals. I no way support Trump. I don't like Trump at all. He's garbage. But liberals, I think, and some people on the more radical left had this hysterical overreaction to Trump. Trump's a fascist. Trump was not far out of the norm for U.S. presidents. Really, just rhetoric aside, his bombastic adolescent rhetoric aside, he wasn't that far out of the norm. I mean, he's a right-wing scumbag, absolutely, and did a lot of damage, absolutely. But Bush was worse. Some ways, Biden is actually worse, or just as bad or worse. So it's kind of like liberals did have this like Trump derangement syndrome was a very real thing, and Trump was linked to Russia, Russiagate, constant Russiagate, which it fizzled out. There's seriously no hard evidence whatsoever linking Trump with Russia, no hard evidence. But and then there's the Syrian civil war, really, really complicated, started in 2011, mass protest movement. Then it morphed into a very bloody jihadi civil war with, I think, something like a third of the country fled or refugees now. Um, so my take on the Syrian civil, so anyway, the idea that Assad is a butcher who's committing genocide against his own people, and he's supported by Russia, backed up by Russia. My take is so much more complicated than that. I don't support Assad, but keep in mind the U.S. in 2012 onward, the U.S. spent at least $1 billion in Operation Timber Sycamore in collaboration with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and the CIA has been heavily involved in Syria basically ever since the French got out. No, that I support Assad, but so much more complicated than the narrative. And like groups like the White Helmets, where products were produced by British intelligence, stuff coming out, the OPCW, the idea that Assad gassed his own people, was faked. We have to face the fact that it's faked. And there's going YouTube drama with Aaron Mate and the Young Turks, Jimmy Dore, the YouTube drama going on. If you've been following all that, the TYT, the Young Turks, are shills for U.S. imperialism, and this is coming out now. Okay, so the narrative, anyway, that Assad is a brutal dictator committing genocide against his own people. He's supporting Putin. As far as I know, Alexander Reid Ross didn't play up the Russiagate stuff, but he did. Russia is a center of all this. Excuse me, that there's like a fascist international. And he mentions Dugin. Alexander Dugin is a big part of this, that there's this fascist international based in Moscow. And it's it's fostering fascist groups around the world. And it's infecting the US left as well, bringing them into this fascist narrative. And he realizes a lot of anarchist thought about the state, criticizing reliance on the state. So he uh, and the book goes into this somewhat towards the end. The book establishes the idea that fascism is a creep, and the whole series of other articles Alexander Rebus wrote afterwards that really slams a lot. I think smears people on the left, and those articles are generally poorly written, uses innuendo and a lot of associationalism, like associates like guilt by association. This person was connected to this, so this person was, and makes these weird inferences, and it's basically libelous. One article he wrote, here it is. It's called the famous article, "The Multipolar Spin: How Fascism Operationalizes Left-Wing Resentment." And uh, the book's claim, the article claims that sorry, book claims that groups like the Workers' World Party, the PSL, who are fascist or buying into moving towards this fascist narrative. Now, I'm not a member of Workers' World or PSL, and I do have some disagreements with them, but they're not fascist. I know they're not fascist. They're strongly anti-imperialist, and they oppose what the U.S. is doing in Syria. They're not fascist. So, Workers' World Party, the PSL, the California Peace and Freedom Party, Ramsey Clark, longtime anti-war activist, Jill Stein. They hate Jill Stein. Really, the liberal narrative. Jill Stein briefly sat next to Putin at a conference or something, and liberals have howls of outrage over that. That Jill Stein is part of this. She's like pro-Assad. She's an Assad apologist. She's part of this. They really hate Jill Stein. So many, Max Blumenthal in the gray zone. So many other people were being smeared as basically being red brown Strasserites or whatever, Nazbols, people on the left who are accused of being somewhat fascist. Which I think is total nonsense. The narrative is crap. And anyway, there was when that big article, his article came out, that one article came out, there was a lot of pushback. It was on the website. Sorry, it was on the website of the SPLC. Sorry, this article was on the website of the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's a civil rights, anti-fascist organization. They have some interesting literature. It was on their website, and there was a huge pushback. A lot of people got really upset, and they deleted the article. SPLC deleted the article. They apologized. Their apology was kind of a half-hearted, half-assed apology, but they did apologize. They were probably afraid of a lawsuit. And then they deleted Alexander Reid Ross's his entire library. He had a lot of articles on the SPLC website. They deleted his archive, mainly because they were poorly written. They were, a lot innuendo, outright lies, fabrications, and smearing a huge number of people. So there's been some pushback, and Alexander Reid Ross has been largely discredited, although his narrative is still continuing. There are many, many other imitators. There's an anarchist, an anonymous anarchist. He has an article on, I think he's a collaborator of Alexander Reid Ross. I thought it was him, but I don't think it's him, but it's a close collaborator, similar viewpoint. There's a website called Libcom, which is a British, UK-based, mostly anarchist or left communist website. It's interesting to read. My politics are different. I really disagree with their philosophy, but they do have tons of interesting stuff. Got to give them that. They have the Victor Surge novels, and PDFs. They have lots of really interesting stuff, and I do read it. I don't agree with their basic philosophy, but they have a lot of interesting stuff on there. Anyway, they have this article which is called It's, it's by an anonymous anarchist guy. An investigation, the article is called Investigation into Red-Brown Alliances that include Russia, Ukraine, and Syria. And it's written anonymously and kind of echoes some of the same points as Alexander Reid Ross. So it connects like Syria, Russia, Putin to imply that a lot of people on the left are fascists. The article starts off interesting. It does give a rundown of these groups I mentioned, but then it goes into smearing. Okay, so a little history of this. As far as I know, one of the first people who were smeared, this might have been rehearsal for this narrative, was Caitlin Johnstone. I made an earlier video where I talked about her. Basically, she's an Australian writer. She was in the outside, as far as I understand, the fringes of the British publishing industry. She got a contract to write a couple of articles about U.S. politics. They were very, very popular, and she set off on her own. She writes on Medium and her blog and whatever, and she has a following. She's a really good writer, has a lot of insight, and I'm a fan. Now, she had a few mistaken positions when she first started out. This guy, Mike Cernovich, who's an obnoxious, nasty right winger. He was a lot of philosophy, developed a lot of philosophy of the incel movement. He's like not an incel himself, but he has his misogynist philosophy. Anyway, he apparently on Twitter or someplace he shared an article, an anti-war article that Caitlin Johnstone wrote. And then Caitlin Johnstone had an article say, we're going to have the left, we'll have to think of an alliance with the right, like a tactical alliance. And there were howls of outrage about this. I kind of get where she was coming from. I understand what she meant. I think she went about it in the wrong way. But there are howls of outrage. And it's the Mike Cernovich thing. She mentioned Mike Cernovich. And I think he should have been called out for this. And she was. Okay. But Counterpunch had this massive overkill. Like they had a whole series of articles denouncing her. And they were nasty articles. They didn't just say, she had a mistaken position, but they really slammed her that she's, a fascist, she's a Strasserite. And they wouldn't allow her a chance to defend herself. They didn't, they did have a two-part article which defended her, but even the guy who wrote this article said, Counterpunch is only allowing me to do this to show how open-minded they are when they're really not open-minded at all. And I get his point. Okay, so Caitlin Johnstone then clarified it a bit, saying, in no way I advocate working with fascists, working with racist, anti-Semites, anyone wanting an ethno state. I utterly denounce this. My position, I was misinterpreted what I was trying to say. I in no way support this, and I think she was right, and she made her point. But the thing is, why this is so important, so interesting. Counterpunch was doing the same thing themselves a couple of years earlier during the Bush and at least first part of the first Obama administration. They were going very much in a right populist direction. And this was remarked on by a lot of people. The late Alexander Cockburn, who's still a revered figure at Counterpunch, he died, I think, in 2014. Interesting writer. He wanted an alliance with the right-wing Michigan militia, fascist Michigan militia movement. He was a famous climate change denialist. He was a huge Ron Paul supporter. In fact, in the middle of this, after this, in this pile-on against Caitlin Johnstone, Jeffrey St. Clair, who is now the editor, he kind of had to sheepishly admit that he and Alexander Cockburn actually went to the Ron Paul Institute in Tennessee and discussed an alliance. I mean, and all these people, Jeffrey St. Clair, Cockburn, a few other like Counterpunch writers, they were frequent writers on this Un's Review, which is a kind of a online journal. I read it sometimes. It's interesting. It has a little variety of like right wingers and left wingers, but they have articles, especially their title articles are often openly anti-Semitic. One of the articles was something like "How the Jews Are Destroying America." Okay, so Alexander Cockburn, Jeffrey St. Clair, and other people have articles in there. Like if Caitlin Johnstone did any of these things, they'd be howls of outrage. Okay, so the fact, and then Counterpunch had people like Paul Craig Roberts, who was Reagan's former Assistant Secretary of State, who is the epitome of a Nazbol. If anyone is his hidden Counterpunch, he would quote Lenin and stuff, and then elsewhere he would go on these rants about immigrants and coded racism, stuff like that. So Counterpunch did the exact same thing, and they have even today have a reputation, Counterpunch, of being red brown. I'm serious. So Trump got in. And they tried to pivot a little away from this a little bit during the second Obama administration, especially after Cockburn died. They pivoted away from this somewhat, but during the Trump administration, this looked really, really bad, especially after Charlottesville. There was a famous incident where these guys were holding tiki torches and chanting, "The Jews will not replace us," and a lot of people, including myself, were kind of scared. It was pretty scary. And the young woman, Heather Heyer, was murdered in a hit and run murder case. And having an alliance with the populist right was no longer a good look. So Counterpunch had to rapidly pivot away. They had to pivot away, and they bashed on Caitlin Johnstone as a way of doing this. So, okay, there's some other people who's used against. I mentioned Max Blumenthal in the Gray Zone. They really dissected the U.S. with U.S. role in Syria. They're being bashed. Like Max Blumenthal is being bashed as a fascist, a Strasser. This is totally ridiculous. I mean, he's the most anti-fascist guy I know. Another figure who's being bashed a lot is Jimmy Dore. Now, I'm a Jimmy Dore fan. I started watching him maybe about 2 years ago. A friend of mine who was into him, comrade, got me into him, and he's pretty cool. He has raw working class anger. I was honestly a little really surprised and was shocked that a lot of people on the left don't like Jimmy Dore. Like, I mean, guys, he's doing everything socialist views saying we should be doing. He's connecting with working people. He's moving them out of the Democratic Party. He's exposing the constant hypocrisy of the Democratic Party. But people say he's a shock jock. He's a grifter. Like, he's not. He's not at all. He's passionate. He's angry. He curses. He's toned it down a little bit. In fact, one person on Facebook actually, who was trans, said to me something like, Jimmy Dore is inciting violence against LGBT people. Like, how is he doing this? This is weird. How is he doing this? It turned out he used the word cocksucker, which he did it in a derogatory sense. Okay, well, I said, okay, it's not a good term to use, and I wish he wouldn't do it. But Jimmy Dore is not anti-LGBT. That's ridiculous. And to clarify, Jimmy Dore himself is bisexual. He's talked about it, and he knows he doesn't use that term anymore. If we're up against U.S. imperialism, those brutal, bloody, one of the most brutal, bloody systems in history with a death toll of millions. And, so many people on the left fit the right wing stereotype of a leftist, like super sensitive snowflakes that, need trigger warnings and safe spaces. Don't get me wrong. I think using the term cocksucker was a bad term to use. I do think it was really bad. And, there's some things about Dore I do disagree with. Don't get me wrong. But I mean, you know, anyway, so I think this person really didn't like Dore for other reasons. She was looking for something. She was looking for something not to like him. Anyway, his Dore's personality comes off kind of basic. He's intelligent. He's filled with facts. But he comes off, he's not like Michael Brooks, who was more erudite. He could quote Marx from the Grundrisse or something, much more erudite. But he was basically a liberal, very much not, the politics were not nearly as good as Jimmy Dore. They didn't get along, by the way, late Michael Brooks, people didn't have a problem with him. People have a problem with Dore. Partly his populist approach, too. Okay, so Dore had, I don't know, 5 or 6 months ago now, led this group movement called Force the Vote movement, tried to get AOC threatened to vote against Pelosi being confirmed Speaker of the House unless she supported health care for all. Pelosi and the Democratic Party leadership is against national health care, against Medicare for all. So this was like getting AOC to call out Pelosi. Now, some people on the left criticize this, say it's reinforcing faith in the Democratic Party. I disagree. I think that's nonsense. It's the exact opposite. It's showing up the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party. It's kind of a transitional method. Pelosi will never support health care, and AOC will never fight for health care. And this exposed her. This Force the Vote movement, which Dore led, kind of showed it really badly tarnished AOC's progressive credentials. This is what she's the most well-known, famous politician in the U.S. today, and this badly tarnished her, took her down a few notches, which is exactly what the left should be doing, exposing these people. Okay, so there's a big pile-on of Dore after that, like Mark Provost, who used to be good, but he's very much of a shitlib. He said something like, Dore is the face of white rage. Like, what the hell? Like, attempt to portray Dore as a white supremacist, a white nationalist, which is absurd. Dore's wife is Mexican American. Most of the people he's collaborating with are African American. He's a frequent guest on Fred Hampton Leftist. He collaborated with Justin Jackson, the NFL football player, who was basically a key figure in this Force the Vote movement. I mean, he's embedded in black struggle, basically. I mean, he's a white guy. He's an Irish Italian kid from Chicago, but he's embedded, and he kind of knows intuitively that black people, one of the most pressed layers in the U.S., they will be at the forefront of struggle. He said this, he knows this. Okay, so there's that. Then there is where he had a Boogaloo Boy on. And yeah, I don't know what to think about that guy, Magnus Painvidia. And it was probably a bad idea. I understand what he was trying to do, get beyond this, like, Democratic Party, Democratic Republican narrative, the red state, blue state, corrupt political theater. I do know liberals who think like it's a boycotting Chick-fil-A, who's a homophobic company, boycotting Chick-fil-A is a revolutionary act. I mean, come on. So Dorr was kind of trying to cut across that the real enemy is the ruling class. And he was trying to kind of do what Fred Hampton did. He said this many times. He's trying to model himself after Fred Hampton. I do think it was a mistake. It was a tactical mistake. The shitlibs already had it out for Dorr, and there's this Boogaloo Boy incident. It put a target on his back. Basically, the Boogaloo Boys are a mixed group. They're apparently militant libertarians. Some of them probably are fascist. So this Magus VD seemed like he seemed like he's gay, and he didn't seem that bad, but I have no idea. Overall, I think it was probably a bad idea, although I empathize with what he was trying to do. So that's one figure. So I think Dorr is a national treasure. I said to a comrade recently, Dorr is actually, as bizarre as it sounds, he's the 21st century equivalent of Eugene Debs. And this may sound weird at first, but that's exactly what he's doing. Yeah, Debs was more of a direct political organizer. Doors as a commentator, but there's a lot of eerie similarities. Doors not a big theory guy, neither was Debs. Doors made mistakes, so was Debs. I mean, they're playing the same role in a slightly different in a slightly different context. Okay, so another figure, Glenn Greenwald. A lot of people really hate him. A certain type of leftist really hates liberals hate him. Basically, Glenn Greenwald was a New York lawyer. He was radicalized during the Bush administration, became famous through his blog. He was criticizing Bush. And then he was a writer for Salon.com, which for a while was on the left. And during Occupy, a lot of following. Glenn Greenwald played a big role in helping Ed Snowden basically publicize it. He published Ed Snowden's documents how the NSA was spying on the whole planet. And he was a hero. Both these guys are real heroes for this. And then Glenn Greenwald worked for The Guardian, British so-called progressive paper. They wouldn't treat him very well, like the British security state, the MI5 and other groups were harassing The Guardian. At one point, they made The Guardian break their hard drives. And The Guardian basically wouldn't back him up. They wouldn't back up Greenwald. He left. He collaborated with founding members of The Intercept. Was bankrolled by Silicon Valley billionaire Pierre Omidyar, but a variety of leftists. He collaborated with Laura Poitras and Jeremy Scahill. Laura Poitras first left. Glenn Greenwald was with it for a while. Greenwald eventually left very recently, a couple of months ago. I question him being in The Intercept for as long as he was, but anyway, he did leave over the Hunter Biden laptop thing, which we'll talk about in a second. So, okay, first of all, liberals did feel increasingly uncomfortable with Greenwald. He criticized the Russiagate narrative and said a few nice things about Trump here and there, though he was on the left. He didn't buy into the Democratic Party narrative. So, big thing, he was on Tucker Carlson a couple times. Glenn Greenwald was on Tucker Carlson several times. Tucker Carlson is a right-wing talk show host on Fox TV. Right now, he has the biggest platform of any political commentator. All the other commentators are tanking, are going really downhill. They were going downhill anyway. Trump gave him a new lease on life because people would, like CNN, MSNBC, whatever, people would tune in to see what the latest twist in terms of the Russiagate saga was. Russiagate fizzled out. Trump left office. And now no one's watching them, except they're all going to Tucker Carlson. He's enormously popular. Why is he popular? Because he's the only person really offering a systemic critique of the U.S. ruling class and what's going on. He's wrong. I mean, he almost initially sounds like a Marxist. He'll talk about the ruling class and the corporate elite. And he actually opposes what the U.S. is doing in Syria and some can even Cuba. But then he gets into this weird right-wing rant. He gets into weird, bashes immigrants and coded racism, and he appears to be pretty much of a racist. He goes really odious right-wing positions. So to be clear, I don't like or support Tucker Carlson in any way. But to his credit, Tucker Carlson he actually has had a number of leftists. Leftists are utterly, on the show, leftists are utterly frozen out from U.S. media. Seriously, right now you will never, anybody on the political left will never be on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, any of the three networks, NPR. They're utterly frozen. This type of discourse is utterly frozen out. So I think leftists we need to take any opportunity we can to get the message out. Now, a lot of people watch Tucker Carlson who don't always agree with him. They don't, his large audience isn't as enthusiastic about neoliberalism or even capitalism as Tucker Carlson is, but they're looking for something. I've had many jobs in the blue collar sector, and I did definitely get this, especially in rural areas, the default ideology of a lot of blue collar American workers is a type of vague sort of right wing libertarianism. And they're the people who watch Tucker Carlson. And like their argument is you should never be on Tucker Carlson because it's like platforming a fascist. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Tucker Carlson is a fascist. He is an odious right wing character. Yes, absolutely an odious right wing character. But no one's going to confuse the politics of Max Blumenthal or Cornel West, who are on the show with Tucker Carlson. No one will confuse the politics of them. Tucker Carlson says he's a free speech absolutist. The fascists wouldn't say that. Jimmy Dore was on Tucker Carlson and got him to support Julian Assange. And then many of his supporters to support Julian Assange, which is more than the shitlib liberals have ever done who criticize this. They don't even like Assange. Okay, so that's kind of the narrative. So we can debate whether it's a good thing or not to be on Tucker Carlson, but so many people like canceled him. Canceled Glenn Greenwald. Nope, it's all over. Nope, whatever contributions he's made in the past. Nope, it's all over. Uh, I disagree with that. It's a tactic, and Tucker Carlson is a platform. That's all he does, provides a platform, and leftists should use it. Okay, also the Hunter Biden. Oh, yeah, Hunter Biden. Now, also, yeah, what I was going to say is no one has fought fascism more in the 21st century, no single individual, than Glenn Greenwald. Seriously, he after years after the Snowden stuff, he's living in Brazil with his partner, and a series of articles, he exposed some of the corruption going on with Bolsonaro. Unlike Trump, Bolsonaro is a fascist. He was part of the military junta that ruled Brazil. He wants to go back to that period. He is a fascist. And anyway, there's this really complicated corruption scandal, and Lula, the social democratic president of Brazil, was arrested. This enabled Bolsonaro to take power. Anyway, Glenn Greenwald exposed some of this corruption and turned the tables on, and he did this at a great risk to his own life. There were many, many death threats from the right wing against Glenn Greenwald, and he lives in a high security compound. There's an activist, I forget her name offhand. She was a socialist, a lesbian. She regarded herself as a communist. She was close friends with Glenn Greenwald and his partner, and she was murdered by right wingers. She was murdered by the right wing. And there have been numerous death threats against Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald risks his life fighting fascism, literally, more than like people like Doug Henwood or these shit libs who are constantly criticizing him. Okay, so anyway, the Hunter Biden laptop thing. So back last year, it came out that a pawn shop owner in Delaware, about 6 years ago, had got this laptop, which was dropped off by Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. Hunter Biden is a well-known cokehead and wastrel. His first wife left him because he spent all their money on coke and sex workers and strip clubs, and it's been well known. So anyway, Hunter Biden's had a career in China, he's in Ukraine, and several other countries. So according to the Hunter Biden laptop story, that there was the owner made this really incriminating stuff on there, made copies of it, and turned it over to the FBI. And basically, the idea that Hunter Biden was involved in massive influence peddling in China and a few other countries when Joe Biden, his father, was vice president. I well believe this. When I shared this article on Facebook, and there was howls of outrage. Like one person who was a longtime leftist unfriended me, got really pissed off, like, "Why are you sharing this shit?" Another person who I like and respect compared it to the prodigals of the elders of Zion, like the anti-Semitic forgery from Tsarist Russia, early 1900s. Like, what? No, it came out that the FBI is actually investigating the story. And I think it's the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. And about 2 weeks ago, there was a liberal talk show, a YouTube show, The Hill. The original Sagar and who's the other person left there, but their new group, but they're liberal news commentators. They had an episode where they talked about the Hunter Biden laptop thing, and they talked about influence peddling. It's pretty much confirmed as true. And the FBI is investigating. It'll go nowhere probably. So if this were like one of Trump's sons, this is one of Trump's sons who did some shit like that, and it came out, it would have been all over. People would have shared it all over Facebook. When I did it, I was using right wing talking points. Like, why are people so, even on the left, so anxious in protecting the Democratic Party? There's no difference between Biden and Trump. I really see no difference between them. I really, they're just as corrupt, just as much scumbags. Except Biden people might be worse. We have no interest in protecting the Democrats, protecting them. So anyway, Glenn Greenwald wrote a piece on this for The Intercept. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't really a long piece, but discussed the laptop story and said, there's evidence to think this is actually a true story and we should investigate it. Well, basically, The Intercept wouldn't let him publish it. Naomi Klein is one of the figures, they wouldn't let him publish it, really. And he left. He left, said, no. I mean, this was a culmination. They were giving him a hard time for quite a while earlier. They were they were censoring his stuff when we criticized the Democratic Party. So he said, Glenn Greenwald said this in several interviews. That the Intercept editors, they're like, some of them live in Brooklyn. They're Brooklyn hipsters. There's like the hipster crowd, and they don't want to be blamed for enabling Trump, for getting Trump reelected. They get a lot of shit in their own social circles for it, so they thought they wanted to just not publish this article. So Glenn Greenwald went off on his own. He writes for Substack. I subscribe to his Substack, and he has a lot of insight. I like him. A lot of people hate him. I like him. He has a lot of insight. So he's on Substack. So what he does, one of his most recent article, I believe, is on the plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan's famous plot to kidnap her, which the FBI foiled. Stuff came out. Really interesting fact that the whole thing was made up by the FBI. It was an FBI entrapment operation. They set up the entire scenario. They do this shit. They did this several times in the Bush administration. They set up these Muslim terrorist plots. It was everything online. They'd lure these kids in and alienated immigrant kids and then ruin their lives. They did this thing with the famous Brendan Darby episode in New Orleans. They entrapped a couple of anarchist kids into like making Molotov cocktails to bomb the Republican National Convention in 04. And they ruin people's lives. They pull this shit. This is under Mueller, actually, big liberal hero. So the government plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen, which was one of these, was set up by the FBI. Okay, it was set. It was a provocation set by the FBI. I strongly suspect the Capitol riot, January 6th, was kind of the same thing. I in no way support Trump. I don't like the MAGA people. I don't support the right wing. But the thing is, what Glenn Greenwald is pointing out, that the Democratic Party, the media aligned with the Democratic Party, is using the right wing, who admittedly are really bad, but using the right wing as a foil for their own authoritarian agenda. And it's understandable these people would hate Glenn Greenwald now. Glenn Greenwald is actually now a frequent guest on Fox TV. Good for him. Good. I understand it. The liberals won't listen to him. Liberals hate him now, and a lot of people on the more radical left also hate him. Fox News people watch Fox News, they'll listen to him. He's getting the message out to anyone. Glenn Greenwald has not changed his politics. He's on the left. He has not changed his politics. He hasn't changed what he writes about. He's just changed his audience. And he's changed, and liberals now hate him. They really, really hate him. Okay, he's one example. There's so many others. Two other examples very briefly. And both were kind of complicated. There's a guy, Caleb Maupin. Okay, now, I don't want to go too far out of my way in defending him, but basically, I first knew about him around 07, 08. He was in the I was in Socialist Alternative at the time. He was in Workers' World Party, and he got a job with RT as a broadcaster, a show on RT. And at the time, I kind of thought of him as an obnoxious tanky, although I didn't really think about him too much one way or another. I briefly met him at an anti-war conference. I think it was in Cleveland, Ohio. He did some workshop. I don't even remember what it was about, but he came in. I recognized him. He looked different look than he has now. He had long, stringy hair, long red fluffy hair. They're totally different. He was with a bunch of guys. They looked pretty wild, like when young guys who like to party. Okay, and so I nodded to him, but didn't really think about it one way or another. So he dropped off my radar for quite a long time. Then a couple years ago, I started hearing about him on Facebook, a left book. People started saying he had a reputation among some people of being a Strasserite, a Nazbol, combining and I didn't get it. Okay, so okay, I'll take your word for it. Okay, sure, fine, okay, I'll take your word for it. I didn't, think about him. I was a bit surprised by that, but I didn't really think about him one way or another. There were some people more from like a Marxist-Leninist bent who liked Caleb Maupin, but other people didn't. So okay. Then again, it was just about 2 years ago. I started watching YouTube videos, leftist YouTubers, Jimmy Dore, and then a bunch of others. And I stumbled on Caleb Maupin, started watching him. And just some of his videos, like, it's not that bad. I don't get it. I was looking, and then more recently, I went through about a dozen, a dozen of his videos. Like, he's not that bad. I don't get it. I didn't pick up any anti-Semitism, any coded fascism. I didn't pick up. He's not, I don't fully agree with him. Like when he, like some of his videos, yeah, I totally agree. Okay, really well said. Other videos, yeah, kind of, but some of the stuff he says, yeah, I agree, but it's not the way I put it. Other stuff, I really, some of the stuff is cringy. When he talks about Trotsky, the Trotskyist movement, he basically knows nothing about it. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and that's fair enough. Okay, but you should make a video on it. Like, I know very little about Maoism, except the basics. But if I make a video on it, I'm going to do tons of research on it. He was like, "Oh, Trotsky was just stupid. He doesn't know anything about that." But okay. Anyway, overall, he's I don't know, he's there. I have some disagreements with him, but I didn't think he was that bad. There was a recent discussion about Caleb Maupin on this group, the Marxist discussion group. Someone had posted a couple days ago, like, what's up with Caleb Maupin, and what do you think about Caleb Maupin? And the idea, that he's a Nazball, he's a Strasserite, a fascist. I kind of defended him like a little bit. I said I didn't really want to get into this, but I sort of defended him. I don't think he's that bad. So one person said, he was a couple of years ago where these ideas come from. He was at a conference in Russia, in Moscow, Russia, and he sat next. It was a Eurasianist conference. There was a journalist. He sat next to Alexander Dugin. And part of this narrative I mentioned with Alexander Reid Ross, that there's this fascist international, kind of the brains behind it is Dugin. He's this mastermind, or very at least the intellectual leader of this red-brown tent with octopus with his tentacles everywhere. So Caleb Maupin sat next to Dugin at this conference, and he said something like, he talked briefly, said, I'm a leftist. I'm on the left. I understand why people vote for Trump. People are looking uh, I understand why people vote for Trump. People are looking for something. It's a type of populism. People don't like the duopoly and the neoliberal elite. But he said something like, but the bankers will never support Trump. And people took that for an anti-Semitic dog whistle, like the bankers are the Jews. I don't know if he meant that way. I don't know. I mean, if it was an anti-Semitic dog whistle, you're saying it to conservative Russian nationalism. I don't know what he meant. It was reprehensible. If it was an anti-Semitic buzz, dog whistle, whatever, it was reprehensible. I don't defend it at all, but I don't really know what he meant. But anyway, he also wrote a book. Caleb Maupin wrote a book, and he wrote a book. It's called like something like the book is something like the Satan at the Fountainhead. And what is it's a history of the Zionist lobby in the U.S. I haven't read it, but people on this thread in the Marxist discussion were saying it's anti-Semitic, uses anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, basically that the Jews were behind the 2008 financial crash. I was I haven't read the book. I was kind of skeptical. I mean, elsewhere, Caleb Muppet does have a fairly good Marxist economic analysis. He understands. I mean, he's not the kind of guy to get into a conspiracy theory. He has a fairly good, straightforward Marxist economic analysis of things. Okay, so anyway, this thread went on. One person said in the thread, look, he said, there's a lot I disagree with Caleb Muppet on. Frankly, I think he's a jerk. But I read his book. I read this book, Satan at the Fountainhead. By the way, the term is kind of goofing on Ayn Rand, the fountainhead of her book. She was a very pro-Zionist. Anyway, this book, I read this book, and the title's weird, but I read this book. It's not anti-Semitic. He's just doing what Norman Finkelstein does. He's discussing the Zionist lobby, how it evolved. He's pretty much the same territory as Finkelstein. He's not. He doesn't blame the Jews for the 2008 financial crisis. You're being too hard on him. He's not anti-Semitic. You're being a bit unfair to him. I don't like him. I don't like Caleb Maupin for various reasons, but you're being too harsh on him for these reasons. So okay, now, I don't know. I haven't read the book. I don't know, but I have a hunch. Yeah, I don't see him as I mean, I don't really see him as anti-Semitic. I'm not going to go far out of my way to defend him because I could be wrong. I could be wrong about some of this. I don't know. I watch him. I enjoy watching him. He's the kind of type of guy. I have some big disagreements with him, but part of another thing, he is kind of a self-promoter, and yeah, definitely a self-promoter, and I could see how this would turn some people off. Exactly. Another thing people had against him that people said his close ties with the Russian and Iranian state. Like what? Like first, it took me a minute to figure out what this meant. Then finally, he has a show on RT and he has a show on the Press TV. Okay, well, I don't know, is it bad to be on RT? Somebody said, yeah, you should never do that. RT is owned by the Russian state. Well, yeah, okay, but should you never be on the BBC because it's run by the British state media? How about PBS or NPR? It's U.S. state media, and the BBC apologizes for a long bloody history of British imperialism. NPR covers for U.S. imperialism. Should the leftists never have a show on NPR if they got the chance? How about the corporate media like CNN, the whole gamut? They're nominally independent, but they're very closely tied with the security state. If you got a chance to be on CNN, should you turn it down? Because it's kind of a ridiculous narrative. I think it's really ridiculous. It's type of like ultra left conservatism disguised as ultra leftism. So we debated. I debated. I said a few things. I didn't want to get into it too much, but I said a few things. And the answer was, the Marxist should never be on bourgeois media. Marxists should build their own media. Yeah, okay, but how do you do that? The ruling class spends billions or like trillions of dollars in building its media pushing these narratives. It's everywhere. We're flooded with capitalist propaganda everywhere. You see airports, dentist office, doctor's office, waiting rooms everywhere. CNN's playing everywhere. You hear that shit everywhere. And YouTube's left. There are leftists on YouTubers are being demonetized. It's really hard for leftist journalists to make a living. There's increasing crackdown, and we can expect a lot more of this under Biden. This is anti-tourism bill, whatever, specifically mentions the left and anti-capitalist, and we can expect there's increasing censorship. How do Marxists or the left in general build? How do we build our own media that has a reach of millions? If I don't support Putin. I don't like Putin. He's a Bonapartist oligarch. He consolidated things. The nightmare under Yeltsin when neoliberals, when Russian oligarchs and American oligarchs were looting the country. The living standards of people, half the population, went plummeted to extreme poverty. I lived there then. Went plummeted to extreme poverty, and Putin is a capitalist. He consolidated things somewhat. Took down some of the big oligarchs, what's the word? Co-opted others, and so on. So I don't get this way. So I don't, I don't get why it's so horrible to be on RT. Seriously, I don't get it. And it's the same with Press TV. If you're offered the chance and they have an audience of millions, take it. I mean, yeah, like Chris Hedges. He's Chris Hedges. I watch him. He's on RT. He interviews people. Lee Camp, a variety of others. A guy, I forget his name, a British guy. He gives interviews of various figures. He's really fascinating. He's on RT. A variety of other people who are completely banned on U.S. media. You will not hear a leftist voice on U.S. media. Seriously, if RT, for reasons of their own, yeah, very well, maybe there's this Alexander Reid Ross narrative, fascist Greek narrative. There are grains of truth to it. Maybe Russia has some leftist on some of their media. There's RT Sputnik, a variety of other outlets. A large number of people from the Workers' World Party and the PSL have some presence on there. Good for them. Good for you. Take every chance you get. Have this weird purity politics where you're talking to a small group of people who already agree with you. Just to feel good. It's not compromising with fascism. It's just sort of paranoia about Russia. Yeah, they are promulgating their viewpoint. I don't see anything compromising in Chris Hedges or Lee Camp. It's red brown. Seriously, I don't. I don't go to Chris Hedges to hear about Russia. And now, if there are other sources I can go to, if I want a leftist analysis of what's happening with Russia, I won't go to Chris Hedges or Lee Camp. I go to them for U.S. politics and sometimes foreign policy as well. But I don't go to them. I don't see how people on RT really compromise themselves. You go to where you can get the message out for various reasons. Okay, one more. I'm not going to go out of my way to defend Caleb Maupin. I could be wrong about this, but he seemed not bad. So, and one more figure, there's a folk singer, David Rovix. Portland, he's from Portland, Oregon. Also, he definitely a leftist. He writes many, many songs about the Spanish Civil War, better Antifa, about fighting fascism, anti-Nazi resistance, various causes. He's a really interesting guy. Definitely, no one can accuse him of being a fascist. Well, he's gotten in trouble recently. Two different things. I mentioned the Matt Heimbeck character. So apparently, when he was in high school, Matt Heimek was a leftist. He went to a David Rovix concert, sent him a fan email. They exchanged back and forth. Then, David Rovix says, Heimek lost his way. He became a Strasserite, joined his Nazi group. And then that imploded him. Now he's looking around for something else, and he reconnected with David Rovix and apparently David Rovix interviewed him, and I haven't seen the interview actually, but there are howls of outrage that David Rovix is platforming a fascist, and you should. What David Rovix says, let's talk to people. We even have to talk to reactionary elements of the working class. Let's talk to people. I believe in the no platforming rule against fascists. I do believe in this. That came out of the Battle of Cable Street in Britain. Okay, briefly, Battle of Cable Street is a Jewish neighborhood in London, and sometime in the late 1930s, this British Nazi group, led by Oswald Mosley, the Union of British Fascists, had a march through Cable Street. And this was when Nazi Germany existed, and much of the British ruling class loved Hitler. So it's a scenario, they had this march, and they were fought back by the residents of Cable Street and by the left, by socialists and communists. There were bitter street battles for a couple of days. The cops, of course, supported the fascists. So they won. They beat the crap out of Oswald Mosley's group, the wonderful thing, and the fascist movement. If they won that, the Oswald Mosley had a series of rallies in the north of England planned. If that had succeeded, they could have gone a long ways to consolidating a Nazi movement in Britain shortly before the Second World War. That didn't happen. Turning point in history. Okay, I agree with this. I totally agree with this. But it's been carried to bizarre extremes in contemporary U.S. versus Britain around the 2000s, 2010 or so, and now in the U.S. Carried to bizarre extremes. You shouldn't even talk to people who are on the right. So David Rovix just talking about Ambeck. You talk to people. Doesn't mean he's platforming a fascist. No one can accuse David Rovix of being a fascist. He himself lost relatives himself in the Holocaust. One of his early mentors, older man who kind of mentored him, was a Holocaust survivor. No one can accuse him of platforming fascism. One more thing, apparently David Rovix defended a guy, Gilad Atzmon, who's an Israeli jazz musician, highly controversial. He's Jewish himself, but some people claim that Gilad Atzmon has a form of cultural anti-Semitism. His famous book is The Wondering Who. I haven't read it, so I don't know, but Rovix said he read it and says it's not anti-Semitic and kind of defended him. So, big uproar about this. David Rovix is really being attacked. His career's wrecked. Basically, he's not invited to play gigs. Anyone who he doesn't benefit for themselves is tarnished. They're red brown. They're Strasserites, whatever. And it really, I feel sorry for the guy. He had a recent video where he talks about it's really taking a toll on him. And only saying that people should talk to one another. One more thing, the Medicare for All march. I went to it last week. I thought I went 40 people where I live, but I think it's a very important thing. The Democrats will never give us Medicare for all, and it should be obvious by now. The Squad will never give us Medicare for all, and they hate this whole thing. They really hate it. So basically, there was a campaign to portray the whole thing as fascist, as infiltrated by Strasserites or whatever. There was some drama that I believe, I don't know the details. I think it was the Muncie, Indiana branch of this movement, and then some Ohio, a few groups from the organizers. They were being trolled very hard by a group of right-wing podcasters. And so the organizers made some mistakes. At one point, they accidentally invited Matt Heinebeck to speak. And apparently the organizer didn't know who he was, and had never heard of him. And then, oh shit. And then they withdrew it. They found, oh shit. So this was amplified by Brian Grimm of The Intercept. This was publicized to basically, and some people, Democratic Party media, to make it seem like this whole movement was run by fascists, by red brown people. No, there wasn't. It was the vast majority were leftists. It was not at all. It's a small group, but hopefully it's growing. The Democratic Party hates this, of course, and they try to destroy it, sabotage the Squad. It puts the Squad, to actually AOC, in a very uncomfortable position. She totally ignored it. Not surprisingly, she doesn't want health care. She's not fighting for health care. Her job's a sheepdog. Her job is to keep people in the Democratic Party, keep them. Her job is to avoid any of this, is to keep people away, keep them off the streets. That's her job. And, she's probably being exposed. She can't continue. So, what I'm saying is, the whole red brown narrative is very insidious, very destructive to the left. I actually think there's some chances, some COINTELPRO stuff going on, whatever's happening. So, anyway, please don't hate me too much. I'm always interested in debating if you really disagree with me. And thank you, and have a really good day. Thank you.